Amidst the success of the fantasy genre over the past 20 years or so, with franchises like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and even Twilight, as much as some people hate to admit it, there were actually far more failed franchises than there were successful ones. Now, first of all, you kind of have to define what a failed franchise really is. Some of these films made their money back. Some of them have gone on to find success with a reboot or a reimagining. But for me, and the criteria that I was working with, was what franchises were planned to have a sequel, or in many cases multiple sequels, but either didn't make the money or didn't receive the acclaim to continue forward. So today, I'm doing something a little different, and I've got 8 movies that were intended to be the first entry to a potential franchise, and in some alternate universe out there, all of these films ended up being as successful as a Lord of the Rings or a Harry Potter. I'm going to go over my personal thoughts on each of these films, how the movies did financially and with both critics and audiences, and how these franchises have lived on, reboot or otherwise. And just to be clear, these are fantasy movies that are aimed at a young adult audience. If I were to talk about failed franchises in general, this video could have been 4 hours long. And this isn't even all of the young adult fantasy franchises either. I'm almost positive that there's more that I've left off the list, but these are the ones that I've seen and the ones that I want to talk about. So grab a snack and prepare to add some rebooted TV shows to your watch list, and let's go over 8 failed fantasy franchises. Eragon is a story that you've heard before. Many times, in fact, even if you've never actually seen the movie, because Eragon is the exact same movie as Star Wars, and Harry Potter, and Lord of the Rings, and Jon Snow's scenes in Game of Thrones, because this movie, and a lot of the movies on this list, follow the story structure of the hero's journey. But Eragon specifically is very egregious about its use of this structure, as was the original Star Wars movie. So if you just replace the Millennium Falcon and X-Wing with dragons, you have Eragon. Don't believe me? Alright, well, Eragon is about a young farm boy who finds a dragon egg sent to him by a princess. This egg is insanely important to the evil empire that rules the lands under their fearsome leader, Galbatorix, which is the most villainy-sounding villain, I think, ever. Eragon meets his own Ben Kenobi named Brom, who takes him on a journey far away to meet up with the Resistance. Eragon realizes that he's the chosen dragon rider who can lead these people to overrule the Empire and defeat Galbatorix, who also happens to be his father. Okay, that last part isn't true, but you see my point. So I remember watching this movie as a kid, and I absolutely loved it. I mean, this movie had everything that I loved. Cool sword fights, magic powers, dragons, what wasn't there to love? This would be the movie that I would rent from Blockbuster every time we made the trip there, and this, along with whatever new Harry Potter movie was out, would be my go-to movies. So watching this movie again, well, I definitely still have a lot of nostalgia for this movie, but it doesn't really hit the same way as an adult, especially now that I can see a clear difference between movies of this quality and movies of better quality. However, yes, there is a however, I actually enjoyed watching this movie again. It's not great, or even good, a lot of my enjoyment is the nostalgia speaking, but I did have a good time watching this movie. Jeremy Irons as Brom is actually really great casting, and I think a lot of the art design and even the CGI isn't bad for its time. But I am largely alone when it comes to this opinion that this movie has any sort of redeeming qualities whatsoever. With a 5.1 on IMDb and a 46% audience rating on Rotten Tomatoes, mixed with a budget of $100 million and a return of $250 million worldwide, this movie did not get the praise the studio was seeking. A lot of the criticisms point to this being a retelling of Star Wars with the same look and feel of things like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter to try and capitalize on the times. There were at one point plans to adapt the second book in the series, Eldest, but after the all-around poor performance, plans of a sequel were scrapped. However, back in 2022, it was announced that Disney would be rebooting Eragon into a TV series. This is a trend that you will see continue on this list quite a bit. Since the announcement, things have basically been radio silent for the past few years, but the author of the books, Christopher Paolini, will be involved with the writing of scripts and is on board as a producer. I have a feeling we might get some information on this in the coming months, and if not, maybe the whole idea has just been scrapped. Anyways, on to the next one. The Golden Compass is a very interesting entry on this list for a lot of different reasons. For the uninitiated, the Golden Compass follows Lyra Belacqua on a quest to search for her missing best friend and a whole bunch of other kids who have also been reported stolen. This mission has her venture north, meet some new allies like Lee Scoresby, played by Other Ron, and also a giant polar bear. A lot of you might recognize this movie by the poster when people are like, hey, it's that polar bear movie, because I know that's what I did for a number of years. Now, I didn't watch The Golden Compass growing up because there was a lot of controversy surrounding the movie. A few of my friends growing up said that the church they went to basically told the families to not go and see it. I thought that was a bit weird, but churches also have issues with Harry Potter and fantasy in general, which is... never mind. But as I've grown older, I think there's a lot of reasons why this movie failed. Number one being, the His Dark Materials series written by Philip Pullman is not similar to any other popular fantasy series of the 2000s. They tried to give this movie the Narnia treatment, which is shy away from any of the heavy-handed themes in the books, and turn it into an action-adventure movie. This worked for Narnia, mostly because the world kind of lent itself to that type of movie very well, but The Golden Compass and this world really doesn't. I remember reading these books as a kid and not really being able to get into them, but I gave them another shot in college and I was kind of blown away that these movies were marketed for children. For those that don't know, Philip Pullman wrote this series as a sort of inverse of Narnia, which featured very heavy Christian themes. His Dark Materials also has pretty heavy-handed Christian themes, although it's not meant to get you into religion, quite the opposite actually. So churches telling families not to let their kids watch it makes a bit more sense. There is so much wrong with this movie, but I think that the worst part about this movie is the tone. Like I said, this was trying to fit into one of the popular molds of the early 2000s fantasy films, and The Golden Compass just isn't really that. It would be like if ABC tried to turn The Hunger Games into a sitcom.
I volunteer as tribute! I believe we have... Well, I bet my hat that was your sister, wasn't it? Yes. Let's have...
So off of a budget of $180 million, which is about double the budget of The Return of the King, this movie made $372 million worldwide, only about $70 million of those dollars belonging to the US and Canada. So I guess the churches did their job to ward off the families from going to see this movie. But this movie is pretty infamous for its monumental flop. This movie is the reason why George R.R. Martin continuously said no to a movie adaptation of his Game of Thrones books, which is why they were eventually made into a TV show, and subsequently why most fantasy today is made into TV shows over movies. And while The Golden Compass failed, it was remade into, yep, you guessed it, a TV show called His Dark Materials, which I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who ended up watching, but it ran for 3 seasons covering all 3 books, and it's genuinely a great TV show. It nailed the tone and is overall one of the most underrated TV shows I've ever seen. I'm considering making a full video about it, so let me know if that's something you'd want to see in the comments below. Now it's time for a movie that a lot of you have probably never heard of, but don't skip this part because this movie actually has Brendan Fraser in it. Inkheart follows this guy named Mo who has the ability to bring the stories he reads to life by bringing out different characters from within those books. When he accidentally brings out some villains from a fantasy book called Inkheart, he and his daughter have to try and find another book to right the wrongs and make everything normal again. Now, this is a movie that I do remember watching in theaters when it came out. My mom was a fan of the book, so I also read it in preparation of the movie, and I remember actually being pretty excited for this movie when it was coming out, only to feel a little let down by the adaptation. I haven't read the book since I was a kid, but I remember a lot of my favorite moments being cut or replaced with other scenes, and upon watching this movie again, I think its worst offense is that this movie is just pretty boring. I fell asleep like halfway through the movie 3 times, so I don't even actually remember the ending, and I couldn't tell you what it is. Sorry to the 3 fans that this movie has, but I just couldn't do it. Now, one thing that you have to remember about this movie that stars Oscar winner Brendan Fraser, and also that girl who is in Eragon, rough couple years for her, is that back at this time, this was not Oscar winner Brendan Fraser. The Renaissance was non-existent, and Brendan Fraser was just a leading guy attached to box office bomb after box office bomb. Inkheart is probably the worst offender, making only $63 million worldwide on a $60 million budget. The author of the book series was adamant that Fraser play the role because he was the inspiration for the character in the first place, so that is pretty cool. And while this film failing is by no means Brendan Fraser's fault, plans for the second and the rest of the books to be adapted were very quickly silenced. And they have never been spoken about again, because Inkheart has not received a reboot TV show, there isn't one in the works, not a movie, zero, nothing, which actually makes this series an outlier on this list. But the series has a really great premise, and I remember really liking the books when I was a kid, so if and when a reboot would ever happen, I'd happily give it another chance. The Mortal Instruments City of Bones is about a girl named Clary Frey who starts writing this mysterious symbol and seeing it in places, and then seeing different things that other people can't see. After her mother is taken under mysterious circumstances, she learns more about her and her mom's past and about a group of demon hunters called Shadow Hunters. So, I gotta be honest here. I actually kinda like this movie.
What?
Is it good? No. Is it riddled with cliches and terrible exposition and bad dialogue? Yes, it is. But I actually really like the premise of this story and the world of the Shadowhunters. I'm a sucker for all things werewolves and vampires and secret societies, all that stuff. I don't know, I just have a sweet spot for it. I like this movie in the sense that I wish that this was the series that got really popular that my girlfriend forces me to watch instead of the Twilight movies, if that makes sense. It's very much Harry Potter mixed with Twilight, and it's very in your face about it. We meet the pseudo-Edward named Jace, played by Jamie Campbell Power, who actually is really great in this role and is far and away the best character of the movie.
Invited him to bed?
I know, it's ridiculous, isn't it? We would never have all fit.
There's also the pseudo-Jacob, so the teams are already forming, and Clary, has to end up choosing between them. It's a very obvious love triangle that you can see coming from the second the characters are introduced, and all seems like it's going according to plan, until the final twist of the movie reveals that Jace is actually Clary's brother. Yikes. Is this a good twist? I guess. Is this a good twist to have in your young adult romance series? No, it's not. This isn't Game of Thrones. This isn't a fictional universe that has conditioned me to think that seeing an uncle and niece be a couple is a thing to root for. This is a story that's supposed to take place in our world, and I just can't get behind that. This is not a good plot point for this type of series. Perhaps that's why the movie did so terribly, making only $95 million worldwide on a $60 million budget. Pair that with the overwhelmingly negative reviews, most of them from fans of the book series who claim that it wasn't a great adaptation, and you have a single movie that, outside of the final twist, I actually unapologetically enjoyed. This movie came out in 2013, and in just 3 years, there was a rebooted TV show called Shadowhunters that ran for 3 seasons before being canceled. Some of you might be like, oh, if you like the movie, just watch the show. Well, yeah, that was the plan, but the opening scene of the show was so cheesy in a bad sense that I literally couldn't get past it. So it was a fun time, but this is probably the last time I will ever think about this series. Next up is Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events, a dark comedy that follows 3 children after the deaths of their parents and their lives living with their distant relative, Count Olaf, who's trying to steal their parents' fortune. If you've never heard of this series, you might be wondering how this is a series of children's books, and definitely how this could be a comedy, but honestly, somehow, it works. This was another series that I read as a kid, and when the movie came out, I was pretty disappointed with it because of how it tried to shove so many different plots from the books into one movie. They actually thought about doing the same thing with Harry Potter at one point in the pre-production stage, combining different elements of the books into one story. Imagine if the first Harry Potter movie was about him arriving to Hogwarts, learning that both Voldemort and an escaped convict are after him, a giant snake is harassing the students, and Harry has to try and deal with all this while also being in the school's competition with 2 other schools. That would be quite a bit to juggle, and that's exactly how a series of unfortunate events feels. I feel like this movie ran into the same issue that The Golden Compass ran into, that being the studio trying to fit this movie into one of the successful models or molds of previous successful franchises, and that just doesn't work for a story like this. Despite all this, I actually like this movie now. It's been a while since I read the books, so much so that I can't really differentiate between which of the plots in this movie are from which book, and I think that the combination of whatever they came up with was actually pretty solid. Would I have watched the sequel for this movie? I mean, yeah, if it had come out, but I also don't think it would have been all that great either. Jim Carrey as Count Olaf is really the main redeeming factor for this film, and especially today, the only real reason to watch it, because of course Netflix then rebooted this series into a TV show. The Netflix series took each novel and adapted it, taking 2 episodes per book, running for 3 seasons when they gave the series a proper ending that aligned with the books. Out of all the series on this list, A Series of Unfortunate Events is probably the one that was given the most justice through its reboot, and the Netflix series is far and away superior to the movie. Speaking of childhood book series that I read as a kid that had a movie that combined elements from all the books, let's go to The Spiderwick Chronicles follows 3 children who move into the Spiderwick estate, their dead uncle's rundown house, and there they learn about the magical world around them. Yeah, that's pretty much it for the synopsis. Like I said, this was another series that combined a bunch of elements from all the books into one film, but with this one, I actually have to argue that it was for the best. The Spiderwick books are incredibly short. I just checked my own copy, and the first book is 107 pages, but there's also illustrations on like every other page, meaning that this book, in terms of pages with words, is like 60 or 70 pages long. That would mean this movie would end right after they find the field guide, and that's about 20 minutes into the film. That's not even enough time to fill an episode of a TV show, much less a movie. The movie itself is actually pretty great. I've rewatched it a number of times over the years, and it's a really fun movie. So what happened to the sequels? Well, to be entirely honest, the way that this movie is set up doesn't really allow for there to be any sequels. Could there have been? Yeah, of course, but what we got tells a complete story from beginning to end, and it doesn't really leave anything up in the air. There was no real reason to continue this unless it was an out-of-the-park home run financially, and of course, it wasn't. But it was met with fairly positive reviews from fans and critics, which again makes this an outlier on this list. And that's it for the Spiderwick Chronicles. There hasn't been... Wait a minute, what's this? Okay, I was wrong. There is in fact a reboot TV show for this series, and it came out, wait, this year? I would love to know if anybody had actually heard that this reboot was coming, much less already out. It's apparently a Roku original series, which I wasn't aware was even a thing, and that makes sense why I've never heard of it until making this video. Apparently, this was supposed to be on Disney+, but it was so bad that they shipped it off to somebody else, and Roku is the only streamer that wanted it. It's got a 5.2 on IMDb off of only like 2,000 votes, so I think barely anybody watched this. Maybe I'll mention this in a few years when the reboot of the reboots start coming out, and I make a video on those. Now it's time for the big one, the one that is probably most associated with failed young adult fantasy franchises, and that's Percy Jackson. Percy Jackson is about a young boy who finds out that he's the son of the Greek god Poseidon. He goes to Camp Half-Blood and trains with all the other kids of the Greek gods, and goes on a quest to retrieve Zeus's stolen lightning bolt. Percy Jackson was kind of like the Harry Potter, but for Gen Z. I was born in that weird cutoff between being a millennial and Gen Z, so I kind of got the full blast of both of these series, but I vividly remember Percy Jackson being the only thing that kids were reading in middle school. Most of the time it was kids who didn't usually read, so for any book to have that effect is pretty cool. The premise alone is incredibly smart and really unique from all other things in this genre, so of course a movie adaptation was on the way. They got the same director as the first two Harry Potter movies, so it seemed all but certain that this would be the next big movie series. But then the movie came out. Like I said, this was a thing back when I was in middle school, and we took a field trip to see this movie after reading the book as a class, and when you have such a bad adaptation that you have a theater full of 12-year-olds booing it, you clearly did something wrong. The characters were all aged up. This wasn't a bunch of 12-year-olds traveling across the country and running into crazy things on the way. This was a bunch of 20-somethings driving where they needed to go. I've only seen this movie once, but I remember this scene where Grover is driving a car, and I took such issue with that because in the books, these kids couldn't drive anywhere. They're supposed to be 12. Despite the horrible reviews and the just okay box office numbers, the studio decided to give a sequel a shot, taking the criticisms in mind and working to fix them in the second movie, Sea of Monsters. In this one, Annabeth is blonde, just like everybody wanted. That fixes the franchise, right? Right? Well, no, it didn't. This one got even worse reviews and made even less money. Percy Jackson was a benchmark for a long time about how not to do an adaptation. The author of the book series has been incredibly vocal about his, I'll say disdain for these movies, so much so that he was the spearhead for the rebooted TV show on Disney+, Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Now this show is very interesting because I've heard a ton of mixed reviews on it. Some people say that it's great, that it's the perfect vision because Rick Riordan is behind it, and some people say that it's so painfully boring that they actually prefer the movie. So I sat down to watch this. I was a big fan of the books, or at least like the first 5 in the original series, because apparently now there's like 20 books in this universe. I have no idea, but I was pretty excited. I watched the first 2 episodes and I thought that they were great, but unfortunately, I just couldn't really get into the series the way that I wanted to. The show is marketed to a very different age group, and had this show come out back when I was in middle school, this would be the greatest TV show of all time, and I'm super happy that there's now a proper adaptation and that kids growing up with it will probably view it how I view Harry Potter, but it just wasn't really for me. Hopefully this series goes on and becomes the mega hit that it deserves to be. Hopefully the kinks of season 1 will be ironed out to a degree that the general population ends up really liking it. Maybe I'll give it another shot if that happens, or sometime way in the future when I have kids of my own, but right now this is a series on this list to be on the lookout for because it could go really well, or it could end up being on the reboot of the reboot list in a few years' time. So last but not least is Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. Now, I saved this one for last for a number of reasons. Number 1 being that this is the most recent entry on this list, although most recent still means from 2016. But also because this was a book series I was unfamiliar with and a movie that I had never seen before. This movie is about Jacob, who finds different clues to unraveling a mystery that leads him to the titular Miss Peregrines. There, he meets different people with peculiar abilities, and it leads him down a rabbit hole of unraveling more of the mystery. This film was directed by Tim Burton. It had pretty good reviews from fans and critics, nothing crazy, but it was well respected and made an okay amount of money at the box office. But interestingly enough, this was seemingly made to only be one movie, despite being the first in a series. The ending wraps everything up in a nice bow, and there's really no need for a sequel. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the Spiderwick Chronicles adaptation. Because this movie didn't make a crazy amount of money at the box office, there was no need to do a sequel at all. And seeing as how this is the most recent entry, talks of a reboot have yet to come, but given as how this series was still ongoing at the time the film was released, and now it's over, I imagine that talks of a reboot are probably not far behind, though this time I'm sure that a reboot, just like every other film on this list, will indeed be turned into a TV show. So out of the 8 different series that I mentioned in this video, 6 of them have either already been rebooted or are in the process of being made into a TV show. While strange, I don't find this altogether surprising, and that's because of one reason, one that I've already mentioned in this video, and that's Game of Thrones. I believe that there's another domino effect that this show caused, and that's for fantasy series in general to be adapted into TV shows rather than movies. With fantasy, the amount of time that you need to develop the world and the lore is infinitely more than any other genre of story. When there isn't proper time to set up the story, you end up with something like The Mortal Instruments, in which 90% of the dialogue is exposition about the world around them. Movies of this genre force the characters' exposition dumps to be incorporated into their character development, and that just never works. In TV shows, you can allocate the proper time to set up both the world and give the characters their own natural arcs. Each and every one of these series was trying to be the next Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, and the reason why they all failed in that conquest was because of one thing, and that's time. I mean, sure, not all of these plots and premises are as solid as Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, but bear with me here. The Lord of the Rings movies are all around 3 hours long, and that's just the theatrical cuts. The extended cuts are closer to 4 or 5 hours. So the bare minimum they could do to tell the story in those films was about 3 hours per movie. The shortest Harry Potter movie is The Deathly Hallows Part 2, and that movie is still 2 hours and 10 minutes long. Studios knew that these clones of other more popular stories weren't gonna do as well, so they thought that maybe if they could just skimp on the money or the runtime by cutting things out or changing them entirely, they might be able to capture the same lightning in a bottle, but none of them ever panned out. And I don't think it's a coincidence that all of the rebooted TV shows did much better than their film counterparts. Basically, what I'm trying to say with this video is that fantasy belongs on TV. There will never be another Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter on the big screen. Even those franchises now belong on TV. And there's countless other examples of other failed franchises like Van Helsing, King Arthur, Power Rangers, Alita, The Mummy, Mortal Engines, Jupiter Ascending, Valerian, I could go on, but all of these fantasy series failed on the big screen due to a variety of different reasons, but the common thing shared between all of them is the failure to introduce and captivate an audience into their world because they lacked the time to do so. TV shows, quite simply, offer more time, which is why fantasy now belongs on TV. So anyways, those are all my thoughts. Let me know which of these movies or franchises you liked or disliked the most, and let me know if there's any that I didn't mention, because I'm sure that there are quite a few. And if you like this style of video, make sure to let me know that too. It was a little something different, but I just kind of wanted to make this video. Anyways, thanks to all my channel members, and I will see you all in the next one.
Yeah.